Look, the family beggar has arrived. My dad mocked me in front of everyone at a luxury gala. My brother added, I wish I'd never been your brother, while my mother dodged my gaze. Then the CEO took the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Forbes-recognized founder and billionaire of this bank, Amelia. That was the instant my family realized the truth had arrived in the most unexpected way. There are moments in life that etch themselves into your soul, moments so sharp they redefine everything that came before. For me, that moment arrived with a sneer from my own father, echoing through a luxurious ballroom as he called me the family beggar. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension, and declared it for all 300 guests to hear. Here comes the family beggar. The room, quick to indulge his dark humor, chuckled. My brother, Daniel, added his own chilling blow, muttering, I wish I'd never been your brother. My mother, as always, simply looked away, as if her silence could still somehow shield her from what was happening, or perhaps from what she refused to acknowledge. I didn't move. I didn't defend myself. I just stood there, a silent testament to years of dismissals, years of being overlooked. It was a familiar weight, one I'd carried my entire life. But then, a voice cut through the noise, clear and commanding. Richard Chin, the CEO, stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his presence instantly silencing the room. Before we continue, there's something you need to understand about her. The laughter died a quick, fragmented death. People caught themselves mid-breath, unsure whether to continue their polite snickers or retreat into confused silence. I watched their faces, a slow, dawning realization spreading across them. Heads turned from the stage to me, then to my father, who still clutched that microphone like a man who hadn't yet grasped that he'd lost control of the narrative. The chandeliers above us seemed to dim, though I knew it was only my perception, narrowing to the sudden, heavy silence in that grand ballroom. 300 guests, maybe more, all in their finery, all suddenly aware that something in the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. The clink of champagne glasses stopped. The murmur of conversation simply evaporated. What remained was a collective held breath, a suspended anticipation. I'd felt this sensation before, not this exact moment, but the core of it, the familiar weight of being looked at without truly being seen. The instinct to shrink, to disappear, to let the attention wash over me like a storm. For 32 years, I had learned to survive moments like this, though never before had one arrived so publicly, so dramatically. My father's joke wasn't new. In the privacy of our home, over family dinners laced with casual cruelty, he'd called me worse. The family beggar was his way of reducing me, making me manageable, a non-threat to his carefully constructed hierarchy of who mattered and who didn't. I'd grown up believing that label, convinced it was the truth of my existence within his world. But standing there in that ballroom, in a dress I'd chosen for its simplicity, not its price tag, something clicked. That label no longer fit. Not because I had changed to prove him wrong, but because the world around me had finally caught up to who I had always been. My brother, Daniel, stood near the bar, his drink halfway to his lips, frozen in a posture of casual disdain that now felt utterly out of place. He'd always thrived as the favored son, his failures excused, his successes amplified. He simply didn't know how to exist in a space where his position was uncertain. My mother remained in her usual place, slightly behind my father, slightly to the side, occupying the precise amount of space she'd always allowed herself. She had a gift for disappearing into her own presence, for being there without being noticed, for avoiding the confrontations that might have protected me. I didn't blame her anymore. I'd stopped expecting her to choose me a long, long time ago. Richard Chin, a man known for his precision and discretion, waited at the podium with the patience of someone who truly understood timing. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't demanded attention. He had simply spoken, and the room had responded. I knew what he was about to say. I'd known for months that this moment might come, though I had never sought it out. I certainly hadn't planned for my family to be in this room when the truth finally emerged. I hadn't orchestrated a confrontation. I had simply lived my life, made my choices, built something that was truly mine. And tonight, by some twist of fate, Those parallel paths had finally converged around me. I could feel the subtle recalibrations happening in real time. A woman in emerald silk, who had completely ignored me earlier, now looked at me with renewed, almost hungry, interest. A man who had just been discussing golf with my father was now studying me with the careful attention of someone reassessing a major investment. The social architecture of the room was shifting, and I was no longer standing on the periphery. I was the new foundation. What truly surprised me was how little I felt. I had fantasized about this moment for years, imagined the satisfaction, the vindication, maybe even joy. Instead, there was only a strange, profound calm. A recognition that this wasn't about revenge. It was about reality finally aligning with truth. My father slowly lowered the microphone, his expression moving from confusion into something harder, something that looked almost like fear. He was a man who had always controlled our family's story, deciding who was worthy and who wasn't, building his entire identity on being the voice everyone followed. He didn't know how to exist in a story where he wasn't the author. The CEO cleared his throat. The room leaned in. And with a clarity that felt almost physical, I understood. Everything that had come before this moment had been preparation. The years of silence, the accumulated dismissals, the slow and patient building of something entirely outside their understanding. It had all led here, to this ballroom, to this breath before the revelation. I met Richard Chen's gaze, and an unspoken understanding passed between us. He knew what this moment meant to me, and I knew what it meant for him to be the one delivering it. We had worked together for years, built something remarkable, trusted each other through decisions that had shaped both our futures. He wasn't doing this for drama. He was doing this because it was true. The room waited. My family waited. And I waited too, though not for vindication. I waited for the moment when the story I had been told about myself would finally lose its power. When the words my father had used to define me would dissolve into irrelevance. Richard Chen began to speak again, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel something that might have been hope. Midway subscribe line, by the way, if this story has you hooked, you're not alone. I've got so many more unbelievable stories to share. So, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The moment, suspended in my mind, lingered long after the ballroom had emptied. But it wasn't the revelation itself I kept returning to. It was the chilling familiarity of what had come just before. The practiced ease with which my father had wielded his mockery, the way my brother had added his cold agreement without a flicker of hesitation. They hadn't even needed to think about it. Dismissing me was as natural to them as breathing. I'd spent my childhood learning to recognize the shape of my absence. Not a physical absence. I was always at the dinner table, always in the family photographs hanging in the hallway of our Connecticut home. But there was another kind of absence. The kind that exists when people look through you instead of at you. When your voice is heard, but not listened to. When your presence is acknowledged, but not truly valued. My father never hurt me physically. He never even raised his voice in genuine anger. His weapon was something more refined, more insidious. He used words the way other men used fists, delivering blows that left no visible marks, but accumulated over years into something heavy and permanent. The family beggar, the afterthought, the one who would need to be carried. I remember the first time I understood my different position. I was 8, Daniel 12. Our father took us to his office downtown. He walked Daniel through every room, explaining every function, introducing him to colleagues. He spoke of legacy and responsibility. Daniel listened, a serious boy being prepared for something. I followed behind them, unheard, unacknowledged. In my father's corner office, he sat Daniel in his leather chair and took a photograph. I stood by the door, waiting to be included. The photograph was later framed, placed on his desk. I wasn't in it. These weren't dramatic acts of cruelty. They were small, almost imperceptible exclusions that accumulated into a pattern so consistent it became invisible to everyone except me. My father didn't hate me. He simply didn't consider me relevant to the story he was building, the story of a successful man passing his achievements to his son. My mother existed in the spaces between these moments, a presence always nearby, but never quite protective. She had her own way of surviving his household, a strategy of strategic invisibility that kept her safe from his sharper edges. She loved me, I believe, in the way she was capable of loving. But she had made her choice long before I was old enough to understand it. She had chosen peace over justice, comfort over confrontation. When I excelled in school, she'd smile, tell me she was proud, but the words felt rehearsed, disconnected. When I won the state math competition in 10th grade, she mentioned it at dinner as if reporting the weather. My father nodded, never looking up. Daniel asked if there was money involved, and when I said no, the conversation moved on. I learned to stop expecting recognition. More importantly, I learned to stop needing it. There's a kind of freedom that comes from accepting that the people who should celebrate you never will. A cold, lonely freedom, perhaps, but freedom nonetheless. I began to build my sense of worth from different materials, from the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved, a challenge met, from the knowledge that my competence was real, even if it was unseen. Daniel, meanwhile, grew into the role our father had designed. He was confident in the way that comes from never having been doubted, charming in the way that comes from always having been praised. His failures were learning experiences, his mistakes, necessary steps. When he crashed our father's car at 17, it became a funny story. When I got a B in chemistry that same year, my father asked if I was applying myself. The disparity was so consistent, it stopped feeling like injustice and started feeling like natural law. Daniel was the sun, and I was something that existed in a shadow, not by choice, but by the gravitational pull of my father's attention. I don't think Daniel was cruel by nature. He simply absorbed the hierarchy he was born into and never questioned its fairness. My mother's silence was the hardest part. She saw everything, understood everything, and chose to do nothing. Sometimes, after one of my father's remarks, she would catch my eye. I would see a flicker there, recognition, perhaps even sympathy, but she never spoke up, never intervened. I used to wonder if she was afraid of him. Later, I understood her silence wasn't about fear, but about calculation. She had weighed the cost of defending me against the cost of maintaining her own position. And she had made her choice. I was not worth the disruption. By the time I left for college, I had already begun building a separate life. A life where my value wasn't determined by my father's assessment. I chose economics not for passion, but for practicality. It gave me tools for independence. I worked, studied, managed my own finances, made my own decisions without seeking approval from people who had never offered it. I didn't announce this separation. I simply stopped participating in the fiction that I belonged to them in any meaningful way. I showed up for holidays because it was easier than explaining my absence, smiled through dinners where Daniel's accomplishments were celebrated and mine ignored, then returned to the life I was building in spaces they couldn't see. The role they gave me was the role of someone who didn't matter. I accepted it for years because I didn't know there was another option. But acceptance is not the same as belief, and somewhere beneath the surface of my compliance, I was already becoming someone else entirely. The decision came quietly, as most important decisions do. There was no dramatic epiphany. I simply woke up one morning during my junior year of college and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I was done waiting to be seen by people who had no interest in looking. I was 20, living in a small apartment paid for by scholarships and part-time work. It was nothing special, but it was mine, earned through my own effort, uncontaminated by my family's opinions. That morning, I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of coffee, a spreadsheet tracking my expenses. I'd been doing this since I was 18, not out of necessity, but a desire to know exactly where I stood. Looking at those numbers, I realized I'd spent years orienting my life around a question that no longer mattered. How do I prove to them that I'm worth something? But in that small kitchen, I understood the question itself was flawed. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I needed to build something for myself. Something independent of their approval or recognition. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. I didn't become fearless overnight. I simply shifted my focus, redirected my energy from seeking validation to creating value. The difference was subtle, but profound, like changing the angle of a lens and suddenly seeing a completely different picture. I chose finance because I was good at it. Numbers made sense to me in a way human relationships often didn't. There was a purity to mathematics, a reliability I found comforting. Numbers didn't lie, didn't play favorites, didn't pretend to see you while looking through you. They simply were, and if you understood them well enough, they'd tell you the truth. I studied relentlessly, not to impress, but because I genuinely wanted to understand. My professors noticed my dedication, and several began to mentor me, opening doors I hadn't known existed. My first internship was at a small investment firm, the kind that took chances on students who showed promise. I was assigned to research, a role no one expected much from. But I took the work seriously, and within months, my reports were being read by senior analysts who had initially ignored me. That's where I learned the most important lesson of my early career. Competence, consistently demonstrated, eventually becomes impossible to ignore. I didn't network aggressively or seek promotions. I simply did excellent work, day after day, and let the results speak for themselves. The firm offered me a full-time position. I took it, understanding something my classmates, moving to New York for prestigious opportunities, didn't. Prestige is borrowed power. What I wanted was owned power, the kind that came from building something myself. My family knew nothing of this. I hadn't told them about the internship, the job offer, the work. When they asked about my plans, I gave vague answers, letting them assume whatever they wanted. My father probably assumed I was struggling. My mother, that I'd eventually come home. Daniel probably didn't think about me at all. I discovered my talent for speaking almost by accident. The firm needed someone to present quarterly research. The senior analyst was sick. They asked me to fill in, more out of desperation than confidence. I prepared meticulously. Standing before those clients, the nervousness I expected didn't materialize. Instead, a strange calm. The years of silence in my family had taught me to choose my words carefully, to speak only when I had something worth saying. That discipline translated into a presence people noticed. After the presentation, a client approached me. "How long have you been in the industry?" When I told him less than 2 years, he handed me his card. "Call me if you ever want to discuss opportunities." I didn't call him immediately, but I kept the card, understanding that doors were beginning to open. Over the next few years, I moved through positions with deliberate purpose, each step chosen for learning, not just prestige. I worked at a regional bank, a consulting firm, then a startup trying to disrupt traditional investment models. Each role expanded my understanding. I began hosting financial seminars. I wasn't a charismatic speaker, but I had clarity. I could take complex concepts and make them understandable, cutting through jargon. Audiences responded to that, the sense that I was telling them the truth. My family remained oblivious. I attended holidays I couldn't avoid, smiled through dinners where Daniel's latest venture was detailed and my life was glossed over. I no longer minded. Their ignorance wasn't a wound anymore. It was simply a fact, like the weather. I was building something they couldn't see, in a world they didn't understand. And for the first time in my life, I was genuinely happy. Daniel had always been the future our family was building towards. I understood this from an age too young to articulate, absorbing it through 1,000 small moments that communicated, without words, whose dreams mattered and whose didn't. He was 4 years older, which in childhood feels like a generation. By the time I was forming my earliest memories, he was already the center of our father's attention, the recipient of lessons and opportunities I'd only learn about secondhand. I don't remember resenting this arrangement at first. It simply was, like gravity. Our father wasn't cruel in obvious ways. He provided generously, ensured good schools and comfortable lives. But his attention was a finite resource, and he'd allocated it entirely to Daniel, leaving nothing for me but the occasional glance of mild disappointment, as if my existence was a draft he hadn't quite gotten around to editing. Daniel absorbed this attention like a plant absorbs sunlight, growing towards it. He wasn't naturally brilliant, I'd realize later, but he'd been told so often he was exceptional that he came to believe it. And belief, in certain circumstances, can create its own kind of truth. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously doubted, spoke with the authority of someone who expected to be listened to. Our father's plan for him was never stated explicitly, but always understood. Daniel would learn the family business, take over, and carry the family name into the next generation. Every conversation, every opportunity, every introduction was oriented toward this future. I watched from the periphery as Daniel was prepared for a life of significance. He was taken to board meetings while I was in elementary school. His mediocre grades were explained away as too creative. His failures reframed as bold experiments. When Daniel dropped out of business school, our father called it a strategic pivot. When he spent 2 years traveling Europe on our family's money, it was broadening his perspective. When he returned and announced he wanted to start his own company, our father provided the capital without hesitation, without due diligence, without the skepticism he would have applied to any other investment. The company was a vague tech startup. Daniel talked about disruption and innovation, words he'd learned from magazines, and our father nodded along. The business model never quite made sense to me, but I wasn't asked for my opinion. The few times I offered observations, I was met with a silence that spoke volumes. My father would look at me with pity, as if my concerns revealed my limitations. My mother would change the subject. Daniel would smile, the smile of someone who knows he is protected. So I stopped. I kept my thoughts to myself. It wasn't my business, I told myself. It wasn't my money being risked. But I watched. I couldn't help watching, the way you can't help watching a car drifting toward the edge of the road. I saw the patterns our father refused to see, the inconsistencies, the elaborate explanations as results became harder to explain. The startup burned through its initial funding in 18 months. Daniel went back for more. More was provided. The second round lasted a year. I understood what this meant. Daniel had built nothing, learned nothing, proven nothing, except that his failures would always be cushioned by family money and denial. He had been given every advantage and squandered them all, not through bad luck, but through the fundamental lack of discipline that comes from never facing consequences. Our father continued to defend him, continued to explain away failures as the cost of innovation, continued to believe in a future that grew more fictional with each passing year. I think he needed to believe it, needed Daniel to succeed, because Daniel's success was his own success, his own validation. Watching this unfold taught me something valuable about privilege. It wasn't just about money, it was about the stories people told themselves. Our father decided Daniel was the future, and he interpreted every piece of evidence through that lens, no matter how much reality contradicted his conclusions. I was not part of that narrative. I existed outside it, looking in, seeing clearly what those inside could not. And I understood, with a certainty that settled into my bones, that the stage being built for Daniel would not hold his weight forever. No one invited me to the opportunity that changed my trajectory. I found it myself, recognized it for what it was, and walked through the door before anyone could tell me I didn't belong there. I was 28, working at a mid-sized investment firm, doing competent but not exceptional work. I'd been there 3 years, long enough to see. That advancement would be slow, dependent on factors beyond my control. The opportunity came as a distressed asset portfolio, a messy loan book from a failing regional bank. Senior partners saw only risk. I looked at the same numbers and saw something different. Patterns beneath the chaos, assets mismanaged but not worthless. Opportunities buried under incompetence. I spent 3 weeks on my own time analyzing it, building models, identifying what could be salvaged. When I brought my analysis to my supervisor, he listened, expecting disappointment. When I finished, he was quiet, looking at my spreadsheets with an unreadable expression. "Are you sure?" he asked. I told him I was as sure as analysis could make me. "Are you willing to stake your reputation on this?" I told him I was. The firm made the acquisition, following my recommendations almost exactly. I was given a small team and significant responsibility. The weight was immense, yet it settled onto my shoulders like something I had been waiting my whole life to carry. The next 18 months were the hardest, most exhilarating of my career. I worked constantly, not because anyone demanded it, but because the work demanded it. Every decision carried consequences. I refused to make them carelessly. I learned to manage people, to communicate clearly, to make choices under pressure. The portfolio recovered, not spectacularly, but steadily. Each quarter, a little better than projections. Each problem more manageable. By the time we sold the last assets, the firm had made a substantial profit on an investment everyone else had avoided. I didn't celebrate publicly. I didn't seek credit. I simply noted the success, filed away the lessons, and looked for the next opportunity. My reputation within the industry began to shift. I was no longer just competent. I was someone who saw what others missed, who found value where others saw only risk. Invitations to conferences, requests for interviews, offers from competitors. I began speaking at financial events, not as a performer, but as someone with genuine expertise. My style wasn't flashy, but it was effective. I spoke clearly, answered directly, and refused to hide behind jargon. Audiences responded to the sense that I was telling them the truth. One of those speeches led to a conversation that would change everything. Richard Chin was in the audience. He was building something new, a financial institution that operated differently. After my talk, he approached me. "Have you ever thought about being more than an employee?" he asked. I told him I'd thought about little else for years. He smiled, and we began to talk. The conversations continued for months, careful and deliberate. Richard wasn't looking for someone to follow orders. He was looking for a partner. I wasn't looking for another job. I was looking for an opportunity to create something that belonged to me. We found in each other what we were looking for. Richard had vision and capital. I had analytical skills and operational discipline. Together, we began to build. My family knew nothing of this. I had long since stopped sharing my professional life with them, partly because they never asked, and partly because their indifference had become a kind of protection. They couldn't dismiss what they didn't know about, couldn't diminish what they couldn't see. I was 30 years old when we incorporated the company that would eventually become the bank. I told no one except the people who needed to know. The foundation was being laid quietly, carefully, for everything that would follow. There's a moment in every builder's journey when the safety of working for others becomes a prison rather than a protection. I reached that moment on an ordinary Tuesday, listening to executives make decisions that contradicted everything my analysis told me. I understood I would never be free implementing someone else's vision. Richard and I had been planning for months, but planning isn't doing. The gap between concept and execution is filled with fear, doubt, and 1,000 practical obstacles. I had seen that gap claim other people's ambitions. But I had already survived the worst thing I could imagine, being dismissed by the people who should have loved me most. Compared to that, business failure seemed almost manageable. At least if I failed to build something of my own, the failure would be mine, earned through my own choices, rather than imposed by someone else's limitations. We started small, not from lack of ambition, but respect for reality. The financial services industry is intensely competitive, unforgiving. We couldn't compete with established institutions on their terms. So we looked for niches where traditional players were too large or too slow. We found ours in small business lending, serving entrepreneurs too small for big banks, but too legitimate for predatory lenders. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary work, and necessity creates its own value. I handled operations and risk. Richard managed relationships and capital. We complemented each other, filling each other's gaps, building something stronger than either of us alone. The early years were brutal. We made mistakes, some costly. We lost clients we should have kept clients we should have lost. The business nearly failed 3 times in 4 years. Each crisis demanding impossible choices. But we survived. More than survived, we grew. Our reputation for fair dealing and sound judgment spread. Referrals compounded. Each success led to another opportunity. The foundation we had built began to support a larger structure. I didn't attend family gatherings during this period, not out of resentment, but necessity. I didn't have time for the performance of belonging, the small talk that accomplished nothing. When my mother called to ask why I'd missed Thanksgiving, I told her I was working. She didn't ask what I was working on. This was fine. This, in fact, was exactly what I needed. Their continued indifference meant I could build without interference, grow without the weight of their opinions. They had written me off years ago, and their dismissal had become a gift, a freedom to become someone they wouldn't recognize. The company grew. We expanded from small business lending into other services. By my 35th year, we were no longer small. We were significant enough to be noticed, successful enough to be studied. Financial publications began writing about us. I declined most interviews, preferring to let the work speak. Richard insisted on one profile, arguing visibility would help attract partners. I agreed reluctantly. The article that resulted was thorough and fair. It described our journey, our success. It mentioned me by name and described my role. I wondered, reading it, if anyone in my family would see it, if it would change anything. But even as I wondered, I knew the answer. My family didn't read financial publications. They lived in a world where Daniel's failures were explained away and my absence was barely noticed. An article wouldn't change that. Nothing would, except direct confrontation, and that wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was simpler, more profound. I wanted to build something that would stand, regardless of whether they ever acknowledged it. I wanted to prove, not to them, but to myself, that their assessment of my worth had been wrong all along. And standing in the office we had built, looking at the team we had assembled, I understood that I had already succeeded. The invitation to the gala arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by courier. The annual Hartford Financial Summit was an event I'd attended many times, sometimes as a speaker, always as someone who belonged. This year was different. This year, the invitation came with a request. Would I be willing to be honored as one of the summit's distinguished leaders in innovation? The recognition came with responsibilities, including a prominent seat at the gala and mentions in the program. I agreed. My personal discomfort was irrelevant. What I didn't anticipate was the phone call from my mother 2 weeks later. She called my office directly, an unprecedented act. She asked if I'd heard about the Hartford Summit. I said I had. She said my father had been invited as a guest, and the whole family was planning to attend. I felt the collision coming before she finished speaking. Two worlds that had existed separately for years were about to intersect, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it. My mother asked if I would be there too. I said I would. She said that was nice, that it would be good to see me. Perhaps we could all sit together. Her voice was pleasant and distant, the voice she used when performing family, rather than feeling it. I didn't tell her about the honor. I simply agreed it would be nice, and ended the call as quickly as politeness allowed. The weeks leading up to the gala were consumed with work, with preparations for the recognition. I wrote remarks, approved programs, coordinated with organizers. Through it all, I was aware of the approaching collision, the moment my family would walk into a room where I was not the person they believed me to be. I didn't plan a confrontation. I didn't strategize a revelation. I simply continued doing what I had always done, focusing on the work, trusting that the truth would emerge on its own timeline. Richard knew, of course. He'd met my family once, years earlier, and watched with quiet fascination as they talked around me, through me, never quite acknowledging my presence. He asked about it afterward, and I told him enough for him to understand. He asked if I wanted him to handle the situation, to minimize awkwardness. I told him no. Whatever happened at the gala would happen, and I would deal with it the way I had dealt with everything else in my relationship with my family, by surviving. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that was professional and understated. I didn't want to make a statement with my appearance. I wanted my presence to speak for itself. I arrived early, greeted colleagues, reviewed the program. The room filled gradually, elegantly dressed people circulating. My family arrived together. My father in a dark suit that probably cost more than his judgment was worth. My mother in something expensive. Daniel with the casual confidence of someone who believed he belonged everywhere. They didn't notice me immediately. I was standing with colleagues, discussing market trends, occupying a space they wouldn't have thought to look. When my mother finally spotted me, she waved with the enthusiasm of someone performing recognition, rather than feeling it. I excused myself and walked toward them. My father greeted me with a nod. My brother with something that might have been a smile. My mother with an embrace that ended before it really began. They asked how I was, what I was doing there, if I'd come with someone. I answered vaguely, deflecting with questions of my own. I asked about their trip, Daniel's work. The conversation was familiar, following decades-old patterns. They talked. I listened. They assumed. I allowed. The dynamic hadn't changed, even here, in a room where everything was about to change. As we talked, people approached our group, wanting to speak with me. They introduced themselves, expressed anticipation for the evening's honors. My family watched these interactions with something like confusion, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed they knew. The gala began, and we took our seats. My family sat together, guests of someone else, included but not central. I sat at the front, at a table reserved for the evening's honorees, visible but unexplained. The program moved through its early segments, building toward the major announcements. I listened with half my attention, the other half occupied by the awareness of my family's presence, by the approaching moment when everything would become clear. Richard took the stage to introduce the final honor. He spoke about innovation, leadership, the qualities that distinguish the person he was about to recognize. He spoke about building something from nothing, perseverance, vision. He didn't look at me yet. He was building context, creating the frame for what he was about to reveal. And in that suspended moment, I felt the weight of everything that had led here, every dismissal, every doubt, every quiet morning of work, every difficult decision. It had all brought me to this room, to this moment, to the breath before the truth emerged. The ballroom, designed to communicate importance, proclaimed this was a space where significant things happened. I had been in rooms like this many times, but tonight felt different. Tonight, I was not simply attending, I was at the center of something about to happen. From my seat near the stage, I could see them clearly. My father, leaning toward the man next to him, talking with the animated authority he deployed in social situations. My mother, smiling at something, her practiced charm seamlessly activated. Daniel, looking at his phone, performing boredom. They didn't look in my direction. Their assumption that I was somewhere in the back, as peripheral here as I had always been in their lives, remained intact. Richard caught my eye from across the room and gave a small nod. We had discussed this moment. He understood the personal stakes, though I had tried to minimize them. He was perceptive. He'd seen enough of my family to draw his own conclusions. The program moved toward its finale. The Master of Ceremonies announced the final recognition, the honor for distinguished leadership and innovation. Richard rose and walked to the podium with the deliberate pace of someone who knew how to command attention. He began with general remarks about the industry, about the changes that had transformed financial services, about the leadership that made those changes possible. His voice was calm, authoritative. I watched my family. My father had stopped talking, attention captured by the mention of significant industry figures. My mother had composed her face into polite interest. Daniel had put away his phone. Richard began to describe the person he was honoring. He spoke about analytical brilliance, about the ability to see opportunities where others saw only risk. He spoke about operational discipline, about building systems that could scale without losing integrity. He spoke about quiet determination, years of work conducted without fanfare or self-promotion. And he spoke of integrity, the quality that underpins every successful venture. I saw my father nod approvingly at these descriptions, appreciating the qualities without connecting them to anyone he knew. Richard spoke about the company we had built together, though he didn't name it yet. He described its origins, its growth, its impact on the small businesses it served. My brother leaned over and said something to my mother. I couldn't hear the words, but I could guess the content, wondering who this paragon was, speculating about connections. Richard paused. The room was fully attentive now, waiting for the name that would complete the picture he had been painting. That was when my father made his joke. He leaned toward his table companion, probably intending a private comment, but his voice carried farther than he expected in the quiet room. Well, he said, let's hope this isn't another family beggar type. The people at his table laughed, the tight, obligated laughter of those appreciating a powerful man's humor. My brother added something about never being related to someone like that, his voice cold and casual. My mother said nothing. She looked down at her plate, the same practiced avoidance of my childhood. The words reached me clearly, cutting through the room's anticipation. I felt their familiar weight, the practiced dismissal that had shaped so much of my life. But this time, the weight landed differently. This time, I knew what was coming next. Richard had heard too. I saw his expression flicker, saw him process what had just happened and decide, in that instant, to continue exactly as planned. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice slightly louder than before. "Before we continue, there's something you need to understand about the person I'm honoring tonight." The room went very quiet. Even the ambient hum seemed to suspend itself. Richard looked directly at my family's table, then at me, then back at the assembled crowd. "The woman I'm about to recognize has built something extraordinary through her own vision, her own discipline, and her own determination. She has never sought recognition. She has never demanded acknowledgement. She has simply done the work year after year, decision after decision, until the work itself became impossible to ignore." I rose from my seat and walked toward the stage. The movement drew every eye in the room, including those of my family. I watched their faces as recognition began to dawn, as they connected the woman walking forward with the daughter and sister they had dismissed for 3 decades. My father's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. My mother's hand rose to her throat in a gesture that might have been surprise, or something else entirely. Daniel's face cycled through a series of emotions too quickly to catalogue. Richard extended his hand to help me onto the stage. I took it, steadied myself, and turned to face the room. "Allow me to introduce," Richard said, his voice ringing with quiet power, "the Forbes-honored founder and majority owner of this institution, my partner, my colleague, and one of the finest financial minds I have ever known, Amelia." The applause began, a wave of sound, but I barely heard it. I was watching my family's table, watching the moment when the story they had believed about me collapsed into irrelevance. The applause continued, but time fractured, becoming strange and elastic. I stood on the stage beside Richard, looking out at a room full of faces, but the only faces I truly saw were the 3 at that table near the back. The 3 who had spent my entire life teaching me that I was less than, smaller than, other than. My father's expression had frozen into something unreadable. He prided himself on composure, on never being caught without the right word. But Richard's announcement had stripped that away, leaving behind a blankness that might have been confusion, or might have been the beginning of understanding. My mother's hand was still at her throat. She looked at me the way you might look at a stranger who suddenly reveals themselves to be someone you once knew, someone you had forgotten or never quite noticed. There was recognition in her eyes, but it was fighting against something else, something that looked almost like grief. Daniel had recovered more quickly than either of them, his face arranging itself into an expression I knew well, the dismissive skepticism he wore when reality contradicted his assumptions, allowing him to reject what he was seeing rather than adjust his understanding. I didn't speak immediately. The moment was too significant to rush, too weighted with years of silence to fill with hasty words. I let the applause continue. Let the room's attention settle around me like a garment. Let the truth of my presence on that stage become undeniable. Richard stepped back, giving me the podium and everything it represented. His role was finished. What happened next was mine alone. I had prepared remarks, of course. Words about innovation and partnership. But standing there, looking at my family, I understood those prepared words were insufficient. I spoke instead from something deeper, something I had been carrying for 30 years. I learned early in my life, I began, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, that worth is not always recognized by those closest to us. I learned that families can love us and still fail to see us, can provide for us materially, while starving us in other ways. The room was absolutely silent. I wasn't following the script for an acceptance speech, and everyone sensed something more personal was unfolding. I built this company, I continued, not to prove anything to anyone. I built it because I saw a need and believed I could address it. I built it because the work was meaningful and the challenge was worthy. I built it because I wanted to create something that was mine, something that could not be given or taken away by the opinions of others. I didn't look directly at my family's table. I didn't need to. I knew they were hearing every word, understanding every implication. But I would be lying if I said the dismissals of my past had no effect on me. I would be lying if I said I never wondered whether the people who should have believed in me were right. Whether I was truly as insignificant as they seemed to think. The admission hung in the air, more vulnerable than anything I had ever said publicly. What I learned, I said, my voice gaining strength, is that other people's assessments are not the truth. They are opinions, shaped by their own limitations and biases, their own fears and failures. The truth is what you build. The truth is what you do when no one is watching, when no one is applauding, when the only recognition comes from your own knowledge that you have done something well. I paused, gathering myself. Tonight, I accept this honor with gratitude and with humility. I accept it on behalf of everyone who has been dismissed by those who should have supported them. Everyone who has been underestimated by those who should have recognized their potential. I accept it as evidence that the stories others tell about us do not have to define our lives. The applause that followed was different from before. It was deeper, more sustained, carrying an emotional weight that transcended polite appreciation. People were standing now, throughout the room, responding to something they had felt in my words. I looked at my family's table for the first time since I began speaking. They were not standing. My father remained seated, his face still locked in that unreadable expression. My mother had tears in her eyes, though whether they were tears of pride or something else, I couldn't tell. Daniel was looking at his phone again, refusing to engage. I stepped away from the podium and let the evening continue. There were hands to shake, congratulations to accept. I moved through the room with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to perform confidence, even when her heart was elsewhere. Through it all, I was aware of my family's presence, aware of the shift in the room's power dynamics. People who had been eager to speak with my father now glanced at him differently, recalculating his significance in light of what they had learned about his daughter. Colleagues who had ignored me now sought me out, treating me as someone who mattered. My father made no move to approach me. He remained at his table until it was socially acceptable to leave, then departed with my mother and brother without attempting to speak to me. I watched them go, their exit unremarkable. 3 people leaving an event where they had discovered they were less significant than they had believed. I stayed until the end, fulfilling my obligations. Richard found me during a quiet moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. I told him I was, which wasn't entirely true, but true enough. I was processing, integrating, trying to understand what had changed and what remained the same. What had changed was external. The room now knew who I was, what I had built. People who had overlooked me would not overlook me again. What remained the same was internal. I was still the person I had always been, the person who had built something valuable through discipline and determination. The recognition didn't make me more capable or worthy than I had been that morning. It simply made my capability visible to people who had chosen not to see it before. I returned to my hotel room late that night and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about what had happened and what would happen next. My family would have to respond somehow. They would have to integrate this new information into their understanding of who I was, reconcile the daughter and sister they had dismissed with the founder and leader honored before their eyes. I didn't know how they would manage this reconciliation. I suspected they would find new ways to explain it away. People are remarkably creative in protecting their self-image. My family had spent decades building a story in which I was insignificant, and one evening's revelation was unlikely to demolish that entirely. The next morning, a text from my mother. "Can we meet for coffee?" I agreed, more out of curiosity than hope. We met at a cafe, a neutral space. She ordered tea, I ordered coffee. We sat across from each other like strangers, which, in many ways, we were. She began with apologies, which I had expected. She was sorry they hadn't known about my success. Sorry they hadn't been more supportive. Sorry for the years of oversight. The apologies were sincere, I believed, but incomplete. She was sorry for the outcomes without fully reckoning with the causes. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her a question that had been forming in my mind since the gala. What was it about me that made it so easy to overlook? She looked startled, unprepared for its directness. She started to offer a response, then stopped, reconsidered, tried again. "You were always so capable," she said finally. "You never seemed to need anything from us. You handled everything yourself, never asked for help or attention. It was easy to assume you were fine." Her answer was illuminating in ways she probably didn't intend. She was describing a survival strategy as if it were a personality trait, interpreting my adaptation to their neglect as the cause of that neglect. I had learned to manage without their support because their support wasn't available. And she was using that adaptation to excuse the original failure. "I needed attention," I said. "I just learned not to ask for it, because asking never worked." She absorbed this without visible reaction, her face maintaining the pleasant neutrality she had perfected over years of avoiding conflict. I could see her processing my words, fitting them into whatever framework allowed her to continue believing she had done her best. "Your father wants to talk to you," she said, changing the subject with practiced skill. "He's struggling with all of this, but he wants to understand." I considered this. My father wanting to talk was unprecedented. Perhaps he was genuinely ready to reckon. Or perhaps he was just looking for a way to reassert control. "He can call me," I said, "but I'm not going to pretend that one conversation can undo 30 years. I'm not going to make this easy for any of you." She nodded, accepting this condition. We finished our drinks in something approaching comfortable silence. Two women who shared blood but little else, trying to find a new way to occupy the same space. Before we parted, she asked if I was happy. The question surprised me with its simplicity, its apparent concern for something beyond social performance. "I'm building something meaningful," I said. "I'm surrounded by people who respect my work and value my contributions. I have autonomy and purpose and the satisfaction of doing difficult things well. Whether that's happiness, I'm not sure. But it's enough." She hugged me then, a real embrace. I let her hold on for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the complicated weight of a mother's arms around a daughter she had only recently begun to truly see. Then I walked away, back to the life I had built, leaving her to find her way back to the family that would now have to reconfigure itself around a truth they had ignored for far too long. The weeks following the gala brought changes I had anticipated, and changes that surprised me. The anticipated changes were professional: new partnership inquiries, speaking invitations, media requests. I managed these strategically. The surprising changes were personal, specifically the ways my family attempted to rebuild connection after decades of neglect. My father called, as my mother had predicted. The conversation was awkward and halting, two people trying to communicate across a distance that had grown too large for casual bridging. He asked about the company, about my work, details of a life he had never bothered to learn. I answered with the same brevity I'd always used with him. He didn't apologize directly, that wasn't his way. Instead, he expressed something that might have been admiration mixed with regret. He said he had underestimated me, the closest he could come to admitting he was wrong. He said he wanted to do better, a promise without specific commitment. I told him I appreciated the call. I didn't tell him it changed anything, because it didn't. Words spoken after 30 years of contrary action are just words. They carry no weight against the accumulated evidence of behavior. Daniel called, too, which surprised me more than my father's call. He'd always been secure in his position at the center of our family's attention. The gala had disrupted that security, and I could hear in his voice the disorientation of someone whose map no longer matched the territory. He asked if we could meet. I agreed, partly out of curiosity, partly because refusing would have required energy I preferred to spend elsewhere. We met at a restaurant in Boston, neutral territory. He was already seated, looking older than I remembered, his confidence seeming thinner, more fragile. He congratulated me, which felt performative but was probably sincere. Then he asked intelligent questions about the company, about how I built it. I found myself providing more detail than planned. Eventually, he asked the question I'd been waiting for: "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I considered softening the truth, but Daniel had benefited from softened truths his entire life. He deserved the unfiltered version. "Because you never asked," I said. "Because every time I tried to share something about my life, you changed the subject, or looked at your phone, or made it clear my accomplishments weren't interesting to you. Because I learned early that I wasn't important enough for your attention. And I stopped trying to earn something that should have been given freely." He received this without visible defensiveness, which surprised me. I'd expected him to argue. Instead, he sat with my words. I was a terrible brother, he said finally. Yes, I agreed. You were. I don't know how to fix that. You probably can't, I told him gently. Some things, once broken, don't repair. The best you can do is not break them further. He nodded, accepting this with more grace than I had anticipated. Perhaps the years had changed him more than I realized. Perhaps the gala had forced a reckoning he needed but never saw it. We talked for another hour, the conversation gradually shifting from our heavy history to lighter topics. He told me about his current work, a modest but stable consulting business. He had learned, he said, that he wasn't cut out for the entrepreneurial risks he'd once attempted. He was better suited to supporting others' visions than creating his own. This admission represented a kind of growth I hadn't expected. This Daniel seemed more realistic, more grounded. We parted with something that felt almost like warmth, though I was careful not to mistake a single good conversation for a transformed relationship. The patterns of 30 years wouldn't dissolve overnight. But it was a beginning. In the following months, I maintained contact with my family in ways I hadn't before. Not frequent, not intimate, but more than the minimal engagement that had characterized our relationship for years. I spoke with my mother, exchanged messages with Daniel, even accepted invitations to holiday gatherings I had previously declined. The gatherings themselves were different now. I was no longer invisible, no longer talked around and through. My opinions were solicited. My contributions acknowledged. The family dynamic had shifted, though whether this was genuine change or performance remained unclear. I didn't fully trust the transformation, but I was willing to observe, to test, to see if their altered behavior would persist. What I noticed most wasn't their changed treatment of me, but my own changed relationship to their treatment. I no longer needed their recognition. The years of building something independent had freed me from that need. Their acknowledgement was pleasant but not essential, appreciated but not required. This freedom was the most valuable thing I had gained from the entire experience. Not the company, not the recognition, not the vindication at the gala, but the freedom to define my own worth independent of their assessment. The freedom to choose connection without desperation, to accept relationships without dependency. I had arrived somewhere finally, not at triumph, not at revenge, but at a kind of peace that had nothing to do with their opinions and everything to do with my own understanding of who I had become. Ending asterisk, I didn't win anything that night at the gala. Winning implies a contest, and I had stopped competing with my family's expectations years before the revelation that finally made my success visible to them. What happened in that ballroom wasn't a victory. It was simply truth, finally spoken aloud in a space where it could not be ignored. The months since that night have been filled with the ordinary work of continuing to build. The company grows, faces challenges, adapts. The cycle of business doesn't pause for personal revelations, and I wouldn't want it to. The work is what matters, has always been what matters. The recognition was a moment. The work is a lifetime. I think often about what family means and what it should mean. I grew up believing that family was the people you were born to, the people who shared your blood and your name and your history. I believed that belonging to them was automatic, that their love was guaranteed, even when their attention was not. I no longer believe this. Family, I've come to understand, is not simply a matter of genetics. It is a choice renewed constantly through action. It is the people who see you and value you, who show up when showing up is difficult, who invest in your flourishing without expecting return. By this definition, my biological family had failed me for decades. While the family I built at work, the colleagues who trusted me, and the partners who supported me had succeeded beyond anything I had known before. This doesn't mean I've abandoned my parents and brother. The connections of blood carry their own weight, their own obligations. I maintain those connections, participate in the rituals, show up when my presence is required. But I no longer seek from them what they cannot provide. I no longer measure my worth by their acknowledgement or their absence of acknowledgement. My father has not fundamentally changed. He is still the man who used words as weapons, who distributed attention according to calculations I never understood, who built a hierarchy with himself at the top and me at the bottom. The Gala shook that hierarchy, but it didn't demolish it. He has found ways to incorporate my success into his self-narrative, ways that minimize his own failures and maximize his genetic contribution to my achievements. This is what people do. This is what he has always done. My mother remains who she has always been, a woman who chose peace over justice and cannot quite understand why that choice had costs. She is proud of me now, she says, and I believe her. But her pride carries the asterisk of its lateness, the qualification of its conditions. She is proud of me because I have become something impressive. She was not proud of me when I was simply her daughter, working hard and growing quietly, seeking a recognition she did not think to offer. Daniel has surprised me most. The brother who dismissed me so casually at the gala has become someone more thoughtful, more humble, more aware of his own limitations. Whether this change is permanent remains to be seen, but I have allowed myself to hope that the person he is becoming might be someone worth knowing. I do not regret the years of invisibility. They taught me things that recognition never could have. They taught me self-reliance, the understanding that my worth does not depend on witnesses. They taught me discipline, the ability to work without applause, because the work itself was enough. They taught me discernment, the capacity to distinguish between people who see me and people who see only what they expect to see. These lessons have made me who I am. They have shaped the leader I have become, the decisions I make, the culture I have built in the company I helped create. I could not have learned them in a family that celebrated me. I learned them in a family that overlooked me. And that learning, painful as it was, has been its own kind of gift. To the women listening to this story, and I know you are listening, I want to say something that I wish someone had said to me 30 years ago. Your worth is not determined by the people who fail to see it. Their blindness is not your limitation. Build anyway, grow anyway, become who you are meant to be, regardless of who does or does not applaud. The stage they deny you is not the only stage that exists. You can build your own stage, your own audience, your own definition of success. It is harder that way, lonelier in the beginning, more uncertain in the middle. But what you build yourself cannot be taken from you. What you earn through your own effort belongs to you in a way that inherited recognition never could. I was called the family beggar by a man who did not understand that I had stopped seeking anything from him years before he made that joke. I was dismissed by a brother who did not realize that his opinion had become irrelevant to my sense of myself. I was overlooked by a mother who did not grasp that I had already found the recognition I needed from people who actually paid attention. None of them could see what was coming. None of them understood who I had become. Their blindness was complete, and their shock at the revelation was proportional to that blindness. But here is what I want you to understand. The lesson beneath all the other lessons of this story: I did not reveal my success to prove them wrong. I did not seek that moment at the gala to achieve revenge. The revelation happened because truth eventually emerges. Because reality eventually asserts itself. Because you cannot hide substance forever behind the veil of other people's assumptions. I built something real. I became someone capable. I created value that exists independent of my family's acknowledgement. And when the moment came for that reality to become visible, I was not vindicated. I was simply recognized for what I had already been for years. The family beggar owns the bank now, not because she won anything, but because she built her own truth. Thank you. Call to action *. This journey taught me so much about defining my own worth. I'm genuinely curious. Have you ever had to build something for yourself because the people closest to you couldn't, or wouldn't, see your potential? What did that experience teach you? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.